Woe to the shepherds who mislead and scatter the flock of my pasture, is what we hear in our first reading. It's in fact the first line of the first reading. Woe to the shepherds who mislead and scatter the flock. In 2001, as I was telling everyone that I was going to become a Catholic priest, God willing, and to enter the seminary in a year or two, the clergy sex abuse crisis broke out in the Catholic Church, first in Boston, and then around the country, and eventually the world. As story after story of shepherds abusing children and teenagers continued to come out in what seemed like an endless flood of filth and lives absolutely shattered. There has never been a greater scandal in the Catholic Church, and it's hard to imagine a future one being worse. It affected me greatly, and I know it affected you here today and continues to stick with us. You and I, our own faith lives, the way we look at the church. And so I hope that we hear those first words of the reading today and take some comfort. Woe to the shepherds who mislead and scatter the flock. Fast forward in my own personal story to 2005. I'm now a seasoned seminarian studying in Rome, along with about 250 other men. And yeah, we were we were definitely overly idealistic. You might even say we were arrogant. We were excited and looking forward to being priests, and we were determined, as pretty much every other generation, not just in the church, but everywhere else. We were those young adults who were determined to not make the same mistakes as the generation before us. And so living at the seminary in Rome for the semester as well, so we had about 250 seminarians, and then we had about 30 priests who were on sabbatical also living at the seminary. They were spending a semester away from their parishes, living in Rome and getting some much deserved refreshment. So they would travel around the city of Rome throughout the day, and then they would come back to us, and they would join us for dinner. And most of us, idealistic and probably even arrogant seminarians, we tried to avoid these priests. They looked like, judging by their appearances, to be the embodiment of everything we didn't want to be. They wore jeans and polo shirts, not their clerics. And we had all decided that that meant something to us. They seemed, based on appearances, to not be enthusiastic about the priesthood. Did I mention we were overly idealistic and arrogant? So the last day that these priests, many of them 20 or 30 years or more priests, the last day they were with us, one of them was selected to say a few words to us as seminarians at lunch. And we were very skeptical. Was this priest, going to get up and tell us we were all overly rigid and that we were too traditional and that we needed to calm down and be more loving? Our biases and our prejudices definitely told us that's what was coming. And this older priest came up to the microphone in his khakis and polo shirt, and we all rolled our eyes. And he took the mic and he gave a speech that none of us will ever forget. It went something like this. When all of us old guys entered the priesthood, we were respected by our families. Our parishes were excited that we were becoming priests. Our communities, even our towns, many times celebrated that we were heading to the seminary. We were thanked, and everyone thought really highly of us when we made that decision. The church was, at least in the United States, at that time in her heyday. But you seminarians here today, you entered the seminary in the midst of the worst scandal in the history of the priesthood. And then this priest raised his voice and went kind of coach in a locker room on us. He said, the church is on fire right now. It's burning with the scandals and sins, and you men ran into the building and said, I want to be a priest anyway. Despite people looking at you like you'd be hurting children, you ran into the burning building, and I want to say thanks to you. And my fellow priests who are here, we've all been talking for the last 3 months about how much we respect you. And we've been talking about how we all feel like the church is in really good hands. We applaud you and we salute you. And it has been an honor to be with you. God bless. Every seminarian in the room stood up and exploded into applause. There's not a lot of dry eyes in the room at that point. We were moved by the support of this older priest, and we were convicted that we had often judged these priests too harshly. That's another homily, some other day. But you and I know, and I want to get back to what he said in a minute, the fire continues to burn in the church. Maybe it has always been on fire. I don't know. When you read the history of the church, it sounds like maybe it's always been that way. In fact, some people would say, well, why do we have all these broken priests? Why does God let that happen? And the question would be, why did Jesus Christ choose Judas? God knew this was happening and was going to happen. He said, even in the Old Testament that we hear today, woe to the shepherds who mislead. He knew it would happen. The wound in the church continues to be infected, and it oozes with fresh pus this week. The past few weeks, a flood of stories have again come out, have been revealed about one of the most prominent United States cardinals of the last 50 years. And everyone says the same stuff that everybody knew, and nobody knew what to do about it, and no one knew who to tell. And there's a fresh trail of people discovered who have been destroyed by his crimes and his actions. Woe to the shepherds who mislead and scatter the flock of my pasture. We might be tempted to think that this horror of priests and bishops failing to live a life conformed to Christ, we might be tempted to think this is new. But the best preacher in the history of the Catholic Church said this 1,700 years ago. The road to hell is paved with the skulls of erring priests, with bishops as their signposts. St. John Chrysostom, the best preacher in the history of the church 1,700 years ago. The road to hell is paved with the skulls of erring priests and bishops. So what do we do about it? Right? That's the question. Again, there's never been a worse scandal in the history of the church. And we know what God says, woe to the shepherds who mislead and scatter the flock. What the church will do about it is anyone's guess. The institutional church, the hierarchy. What I pray, the response is dramatic, swift, and far-reaching. 500 years ago, the clergy was in an awful state morally, and the Council of Trent made drastic changes and put a seminary structure in the place for the first time. I hope other changes are continuing to be made, but what a 39-year-old priest in Western Indiana thinks needs to be done typically isn't asked. So I'll save that for another homily too. What do we do? You and I. Not what does Pope Francis do? Not what does the USCCB do? What do we do? And in one sense, I can say I'm not even sure I could say that I fault people who leave. It is all so awful. But I want to challenge us to do something. I want to challenge you to run back into the building that is on fire and help put it out and help rebuild. I don't fault you if these past 17 years have made you seriously question your Catholic faith. It certainly has made me question mine. But I want to invite us to run back in. We are the church too, not just the shepherds. And there are also a lot of really good priests and holy people. And so I say, let's do it together. Let's encourage good young men and women to enter the religious life as priests and sisters, to rebuild and put out the fire. Our children. It's easy to want someone else's child to consider to being a priest or a religious. Are we willing to suggest ours? And let's also recognize that you and I have the ability to also rebuild. It's not just clerics and nuns that make up the Catholic Church. Let's recognize that we can all still be a saint as a Catholic layperson, even if some in the hierarchy of the church are living completely morally bankrupted lives. Let's look at that first reading again, because it ends on a positive note and it talks about this. God says, I will deal with them, the shepherds. Woe to them. But then God says this, I myself will gather the remnant of my flock from all the lands to which I have driven them and bring them back to their meadow. The people who've left because of scandal, the people who've been hurt, God says, I will bring my flock back to the meadow, and there they shall increase and multiply. I will appoint shepherds for them who will shepherd them, so that they need no longer fear and tremble. God wants to do that, and He wants to do it through you and I, and through the next generation of young people coming up. That's how God wants to bring everyone back. I invite you to join me as we run back in and double down our commitment to be Catholic Christians in a church and a world that needs us. Let us rise and be on our way to becoming saints.